I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Jeremy Carl.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today, we've got plenty of topics. First, I'm going to be talking about how the Supreme Court has blocked the use of the Alien Enemies Act, at least temporarily, and what bodes for the future. Inez is going to talk about Schedule F and firing civil servants. Amber is going to talk about the reported chaos at the Pentagon ? Right? Is there actually chaos or not? And finally, Jeremy is going to cover the death of Pope Francis. So first, I'll get it started with the Alien Enemies Act. So over the weekend, we had some very dramatic Supreme Court shenanigans. And there was an administrative stay issued on the evening of Good Friday, very late in the evening, attempting to stop the use of the Alien Enemies Act to deport a class of Venezuelan illegal immigrants. The stay was issued by the Supreme Court. It was procedurally bizarre because it was issued before either the district court or the Fifth Circuit Appeals had actually ruled on the underlying issue. And Justice Alito, along with Justice Thomas, issued a very aggressive dissent about these procedural issues. The fact that the Supreme Court was reaching and violating its normal regular order procedures in order to put in place this administrative stay. Now, because it's an administrative stay, it's likely to be lifted in the next few days. I think that John Sauer, the Solicitor General, has put out an excellent brief kind of explaining the underlying flaws in the reasoning of what the Supreme Court did, and basically echoing a lot of Justice Alito's dissent. I don't think there's 5 justices who are going to go along with this procedural ridiculousness. But even so, it is a bizarre move for the Supreme Court to have made. They should have not made it in the first instance. And there's other interesting problems here, which is, why are they doing this? Well, it's a suit being brought by the ACLU. And the ACLU apparently tried to engage in ex parte communications with the district judge in this case, calling up the district judge to tell them, hey, what the status was and why they so badly needed it. That's improper. Litigants are not supposed to do that, because the idea of an ex parte communication is it's just you talking to the judge, and it could be off the record. The other side couldn't hear about it and not know what exactly is being presented to the judge, and it makes it hard to understand what the record was. And judges are supposed to aggressively avoid any ex parte communications that are substantive about any case. And yet that happened here, and it's not clear whether or not that happened at the Supreme Court or the appellate court as well. Like, how many voicemails were the litigants at ACLU leaving to try and get the court to do what it wanted? And I think Mike Davis had some great tweet about the fact that, are our courts letting the ACLU be used as their clerks, as their legal advisors, trying to get them to do what they want, or are they litigants taking this seriously? I think the Supreme Court's facing a legitimacy crisis, and a big part of why supposedly they didn't stop all the shenanigans over the past 2 months relating to all these different lawless temporary restraining orders. Their whole point was, we want it to come up on regular order. This is a weird procedural posture. We want it to come up normally with normal appellate briefing. Well, then you can't go around and randomly start issuing administrative stays when there's not even an underlying decision. They need to start being consistent in what they want to do. They need to start acting like legitimacy matters, and they need to lift the stay and start treating Article 2 with proper respect. That's my view. I wonder what you guys have to say about it.
Yeah, I think the Supreme Court has been really inconsistent with the way that it's decided to deal with these massive lawsuits and lower court injunctions against the Trump administration. On some cases, it's waited months to weigh in on these issues, sort of letting the executive power be in limbo in the meantime. In this case, they acted really late on Friday night without even really giving the Trump administration time to respond or question what the court was doing. And then in other cases, they've basically washed their hands entirely. So it's really confusing for the Trump administration, who is trying to exercise its normal executive function, to have to deal with the Supreme Court that is increasingly acting in a very rogue manner. And I'm not even sure how you contend with that. I mean, you have some conservative commentators on social media suggesting that the Trump administration just entirely ignored the Supreme Court. And then you have other people saying that even criticizing the Supreme Court is evidence that the Trump administration is acting improperly and refusing to respect the rule of law. So they kind of seem stuck between a rock and a hard place here. On the specific Alien Enemies Act issue, I mean, we've seen this both in this case, but then also more specifically in the Abrego Garcia case, where the Trump administration has been asked to quote unquote facilitate his return, and it hasn't really been clarified as to what facilitate actually means. Like the Democrats seem to be implying that Trump needs to completely end his contract with El Salvador for the gang members being sent to CCOP prison. It almost seems like they want him to like execute a Navy SEAL kidnapping of Abrego Garcia to bring him back to the United States, or else they won't be satisfied. Whereas the Trump administration is like, well, he's a Salvadorian national in Salvadorian custody. If we ask Bukele for him back and he says no, that's really the end of the matter. So all of this confusion, I think, is really problematic for just trying to govern at this point. And I think, Will, you laid out some helpful suggestions for the Supreme Court on how to provide some clarity to people so that the Trump administration can both understand what its powers are currently, the reasonable time in which they're able to respond to these court cases, and then for the challenger side, presenting reasonable expectations and lawful expectations of how they're supposed to actually communicate with the courts and bring these cases. So it just seems we're in a really murky spot right now.
Yeah, well, Will, you've done a great job of sort of highlighting some of the sort of shenanigans going on X, and that's been really helpful for those of us who are non-lawyers looking at this. But my kind of broad view has been at a time in which the Supreme Court desperately needs an actual leader. We have sort of the ultimate insider politician running it, John Roberts, and that is really unfortunate. I don't know that, and plus he hates Trump, right? And so it's a real problem. And I think the real problem, it's a little bit like the Russia-Ukraine war analogy, where I think the different sides have kind of, I think, a dangerously, particularly the Ukrainians, maybe a naive view of like what their like BATNA is, right? I think that they have the wrong BATNA in mind, and I think that's a best alternative to a negotiated agreement for non-negotiators here. And I think Roberts feels like nobody could really challenge the court's power in a serious way, and I think he's misreading the room in doing that. I posted a piece from Ed that was quoting a speech from Ed Meese that people have forgotten about from 1986 when he was Reagan's attorney general. But it got quite a lot of attention at the time, in which Meese basically said, hey, the Supreme Court actually doesn't get to decide what the law is. They can decide particular cases, and that's it. And that's a way of saying, I mean, that's sort of, you don't hear that a lot until at least very recently in mainstream discourse. But this was, I mean, it was a controversial but mainstream point put out by the Attorney General for the great kind of traditional conservative hero. And I think, I mean, first of all, I want the Trump administration to be much more aggressive on these things. I think it's justified. I think the actual rule of law in any meaningful sense is being violated by what the left is doing rather than the procedural rule of law that the left wants us to play by. But beyond that, I think that the danger is that the Supreme Court doesn't feel like the Trump administration might really fundamentally challenge them, or at least the lower courts, in what they do. And my read is that that's actually, knowing a few of the folks involved, not having talked to them specifically about this, but just knowing folks in the Trump Justice Department, I think that's a mistaken view, and that puts us in a very dangerous place, in my view.
I agree with Jeremy that it's dangerous. It's funny because John Roberts famously is so invested in the reputation of the court, and for non-silly reasons or non-trivial reasons, right? I think this objection of his is often like boiled down to kind of like, oh, wanting to stay on the cocktail circuit, and I actually don't think that's true. I mean, there is a very real concern for the court as a branch without executive power, without legislative power, without any real way to effectuate its decision making, into real life, right? Manifested into real life. they have always been dependent on the executive branch to enforce and for Congress to listen to their rulings, essentially. And this kind of free-floating balance of power goes back to, Marbury v. Madison days, right? And so I don't think it's an entirely silly concern on the part of John Roberts, even though I think that he often goes about it badly. Like, you should still ultimately your highest, your highest guiding post as a judge should be to rule on the law as you see the law dictating, which John Roberts famously flipped his opinion in Obamacare. It was very clear sometimes that he's reasoning backwards from this consideration, essentially political consideration. But that doesn't mean that political consideration is wrong or misplaced. And I do think he probably thinks a little too much, rightfully so, given the rumblings for the last 4 years about expanding the court, for example, on the left. But he's given too much credence to ensuring that the court maintains its reputation and its legitimacy on the left, something which I think has been a fool's errand, considering how much the left hates the institutions of this country fundamentally and hates the constitutional balance of power. But he's been very involved in that project, and he seems curiously sort of naive, as Jeremy said, to losing legitimacy of the courts on the right. In particular, the comments that Will made in the beginning about doing this out of order. If you're going to challenge something that's immensely popular, I mean, the Supreme Court sometimes has to stop things that are immensely popular in the country, right? That is part of their job. If those things are unconstitutional in their view, like, that is part of their job. But they should absolutely be careful in doing that they don't lose the legitimacy that allows them to move forward and to have the ruling of the Supreme Court stand without any, there's no magical wand in all of this. I think people think about constitutional law and the branches and the separation of power as though it's all like written in stone. And if you violate the letter, no, it's really just more free floating, these three branches with different powers that challenge each other, all having an independent duty to the Constitution, all having an independent duty to enforce their various powers and use their various powers. Ultimately, those things are free floating and depend on the respect that the branches grant each other. And the Supreme Court is the weakest in that regard between the two elected branches, being removed from the people intentionally. So all of that is like background noise. I do think on this particular issue, we are going to have to come to some kind of process that is due, right? That is acceptable to the courts, that's acceptable to the Trump administration and the American people, because fundamentally what we have right now is this imbalance where we had, by some accounts, 10 million people coming into the country in the last 4 years with no process at all. And if each one of them has what Garcia had, right, which is 3 different hearings on different matters, right? Establishing him as removable, establishing him as a likely gang member, both those things he had full due process on in the courts. The pending claim and the snafu here is that he had a last minute asylum claim, which I know Will went through excellently last week and I won't repeat. But, if every one of those 10 million people is entitled to 3 or more hearings in the United States before they're deportable, we will never deport 10 million people. And then that is like the game here. So we're going to have to come to some understanding, not about eliminating due process for people, because as I've said multiple times on this issue, I do believe people need a due process. We need to make sure that we're not making errors in this like very large and messy operation to try to remove illegal aliens from the country. But the question of what process is due is very much something that has yet to be hammered out, both between the Trump administration and the courts. And ultimately, I don't think the American people are going to accept the idea that it's simply impossible to deport the 10 million people who have come here to the country illegally. It's just that it's going to become impossible because the courts are going to make it so. I think that's probably a really dangerous game that the courts are playing.
Okay, Inez, we're going to go right back to you and a little more efficiently. Hopefully schedule F Redux.
Yeah, so this should be familiar to some folks who were watching Trump 1 administration. This is essentially a redux of something that the first Trump administration was looking at the end. And it's reclassifying, in this case, about 50,000 federal employees as policymakers. These are people who are having direct input on regulation, on adjudication decisions, in other words, on the practice of governance, right, in the executive branch. And reclassifying them essentially as at-will employees, which, as I've said before, 75% of Americans work at will, right? But the federal government does not work at will. There are tons of civil service protections that are supposed to insulate civil servants, quote unquote. And they've insulated themselves so well that they are not only insulated from kind of crude political machinations, but they're insulated entirely from any kind of course correction on policy from the American people, any democratic accountability to any of the elected actors. And that's what we, here on this podcast and elsewhere call, the deep state or the administrative state, right? Essentially, we've had a state made up of unelected actors, unelected bureaucrats that make really, political decisions, policy-making decisions, things that affect our lives as citizens. These decisions are not made by the people that we elect to office, whether it's the president every 4 years or whether it's Congress, right? These decisions are made by people who we have apparently no ability to tell what to do or to fire if they don't follow the general direction set by the American people. So that's really what's at stake here. The Trump administration has taken a very comprehensive, I would say, and very intelligent sort of battle to the administrative state across a bunch of different fronts, this being only one of them. There are a whole series of cases, speaking of the Supreme Court, whole series of cases that are working their way towards what is likely the Supreme Court on essentially the president's removal powers under Article 2. So what if, what is the limit that Congress, even laws passed by Congress, can protect people of various positions in the executive branch from being hired and fired by the president. And each agency will present different issues to the court slightly, right? So you have, for example, the head of the Merit Service Protection Board who was fired. This is the person who's dealing with all of these appeals of these civil servants, right? That agency has very specific structure that's outlined by Congress versus the CFPB that has, a more independent structure that's outlined by Congress. Right? So the question is, can Congress create an agency and staff it with people that are essentially insulated from the president? I think the obvious constitutional answer is no. If the president ultimately cannot choose his subordinates, he cannot, and this is what we saw so clearly with Trump 1, right? He cannot get his policy through his own executive branch. Right, we have the problem of hashtag resistance from inside the executive branch. Well, there is no legitimacy for unelected actors in the executive branch to set policy for the United States. It's not constitutional, and it's not even small t democratic. So these are going to be exciting cases. This is going to just add to it because, of course, employee unions immediately sued over this reclassification of policymaking employees to at-will employment. But I think this is common sense. This is something that, once again, like everything that we're talking about, will get stoppered up in the courts. But I think ultimately, perhaps unlike some of these other issues, I think we have a really good chance in the Supreme Court, not just to, back up the Trump administration in these reforms that are making government more efficient and more accountable. That's sort of one layer of this, but really to bring to court the legitimacy and constitutionality of the administrative state system, the way that it's operated for decades now. Some of these protections go back a century, but this truly unaccountable way that the deep state has been acting really goes back to the late 80s and the 90s, a combination of removing the civil service merit exam so like that removed any kind of like sort of impartial merit-based way of selecting and hiring and firing and promoting people within the executive branch. And then going ahead and introducing collective bargaining, which FDR famously said, was crazy to have collective bargaining in the federal employee context. But those two things really eviscerated the last real pieces of the president's control over the executive branch. And this is something that's been, was criticized by Carter and restored by Carter. Reagan used tools that don't exist in the federal bureaucracy anymore to go ahead and hire and fire people in the executive branch. So this is, the level of insulation these people have built around themselves is something new. But I don't know what you guys think. I know that that's a lot of information, and the civil service always seems like something that's very wonky and unimportant. But I really do think this is the crux of all of the battles here. And in a large part, it's about being able, the American people fundamentally being able to change course if they elect someone who wants to do that. And what we've saw in Trump 1 is that it's really basically impossible to do that without being able to fire the deep state.
Yeah, I'm all for putting as many people under Schedule F as possible. I think we just have this foundational misunderstanding of the way our government ought to function. There should be political control of the executive branch, and it's extremely difficult to do that when only the top 2 or 3 people are allowed to be political appointees. That just needs to change. If you are in any part of setting policy, you don't get to be a career employee. I'm sorry, you have to be appointed and easily fireable, easily accountable to the people above you. And I think our government will just function a lot better if once that's the case.
There also seems to be this fundamental conceit that the reason why these people need to be in the government for so long is because they have special expertise that gives them this mandate to basically be in there for 30, 40 years because nobody else could possibly do their job as well as they do, or they don't have subject matter expertise the way that they do. And as we've been sort of pulling back the hood on the government bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy, it's become very clear that that's not the case. I mean, even people who were deemed experts during the COVID pandemic, people like Fauci, who were in government for 30, 40 years, who were heading up these agencies on epidemiology, had actually very little background in epidemiology and made all kinds of public health decisions that were at odds with the science. So if you take that example and distill that down into places like the EPA or BLM, which I know Jeremy is very familiar with, like, no, these people actually don't know much of anything at all. And their expertise is limited to silly things like paperwork and processes that are inherently part of a bureaucracy. But do we really need paperwork experts or database experts to be in their roles? Tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of paperwork experts in these roles when they're going to then use that expertise as a means of log jamming the political, actual elected official by the people, their agenda. It's so backwards to having power be rested in the hands of the people. So the arguments that you hear against things like Schedule F are just based on a lie, the lie of federal bureaucracy expertise.
Yeah, I think this is it's fantastic. I think if you want to crystallize the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2, we didn't see this in Trump 1 until I think even after the election, or if not, it was maybe like 2 weeks before the election, and there was no chance to kind of fundamentally actually do anything useful about it, even though it had been proposed. I mean, I've talked to people involved with it. It had been kicking around since early in Trump 1, but it never saw the light of day. Now we're like 3 months into Trump 2, and they're like, hey, let's do this. It is great. I have managed briefly a large federal bureaucracy, and even in that time, I mean, it was really clear to me that there were just a few people who were senior who were trying to thwart what I would like to do, and that power to just being delegated to me through the president of the United States. I mean, not my own power, but acting on behalf of the president. And it's ludicrous that we should have to have these people be part of the process. And at the end of the day, of course, like these people actually do have all this institutional memory, and in theory, I would like to keep them all around and have them be functional, but they have to do what I want them to do. I mean, that's the only way that it functions. I mean, as long as what I'm asking them to do is legal. If we don't have that, we don't have a real democratic government. And to kind of come back to what Will said, you've got like people are just thinking about the entire system of governance in the wrong way. So we need to fix that, and hopefully Schedule F can do that.
All righty, we'll push it over to Amber, Chaos at the Pentagon.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of seeming turmoil, at least if you are reading the news reports in the State Department. And a lot of it came out of this new report from the New York Times indicating that Hegseth was potentially involved in a second signal chat where he was sharing information about Houthi strikes with his brother and his wife. But really, I think this story is much broader and deeper than just the existence of a signal chat. There's been a lot of very high-profile exits from the State Department over the past couple of weeks, and a lot of them are very notable non-interventionist. I'm thinking, for example, of Dan Caldwell, from Defense Priorities, who was allegedly pushed out over leaks. He says that he didn't leak any information. He's a pretty well-respected guy in the intelligence community and the defense community. Excuse me, Department of Defense. I said Department of State earlier. State Department. It's Department of Defense. There's other things happening at state too, which I might get to in a minute. But for purposes of this section, we're talking about Department of Defense. So Dan Caldwell pushed out several of his colleagues, all of whom were accused of sharing classified information or leaking things to people in unauthorized disclosures. They all deny this pretty vehemently and seem to be hinting at the idea that this is more of an ideological battle that's happening in the Department of the Defense. And it's not as clear as I would hope it would be from the outside, because Hegseth has at least publicly sort of brought in some of these people, whether it's like Michael Anton or Elbridge Colby, and even Caldwell and his compadres. But then also in the first signal chat that was published in The Atlantic was arguing against Vice President J.D. Vance alongside Mike Waltz, advocating for strikes against the Houthis when Vance was sort of questioning the reflexive nature with which they were going to implement those strikes. So it seems to me like there's a couple of possibilities here. Maybe Hegseth is in survival mode, and there's people around him who are pushing out the non-interventionists, and he's kind of worried about his own future at the Pentagon. Maybe he's more hawkish than people realized, or that he signaled publicly in his confirmation hearing, which I think is entirely possible if you go back to some of the things that he was saying on Fox News, prior to him getting the nomination from Trump. And then it's also possible that he's just been totally usurped by other people in the Pentagon. It's not entirely clear to me what's happening, so I'm interested to hear y'all's thoughts on this. But this sort of culminated in John Elliott, who was the Pentagon spokesperson, leaving his position seemingly voluntarily and then writing this op-ed in Politico about the quote-unquote chaos at the Pentagon, and talking about how he was very aligned with the president's vision, but felt like there was so much in terms of these signal chats, of general inability from the people who have been chosen for those roles to actually execute the president's vision. Just basically the Pentagon being in a tailspin, and he felt like he had to leave because it wasn't really going the direction that he wanted it to go. So I will open it up to you guys, and I'll save my thoughts about the State Department for final thoughts. I think I might have touched on that last week as well. But it's all very strange. And just to add a little bit more context about Elliot, I've met him a few times at One America News in the green room, of all places. So I don't think that he's some, anti-Trump hater or massive war hawk who was trying to undermine Hegseth or anything of that nature. He said he respects Hegseth greatly. So I don't automatically dismiss what he wrote in Politico. I do think Politico was an interesting choice to take that message to. But anyway, maybe you guys can help me put the puzzle pieces together. Clearly something is happening. I just don't know exactly whether it's an ideological battle over just the interventionist versus the non-interventionist, whether it's specifically about Iran and the administration's seeming willingness to bomb Iran if they attack Israel, or whether they want to negotiate with Iran and have a second Iran deal. There's just so many moving parts here. And I think a lot of, people on the outside, both in the sort of America First camp and then even on the left side of things, are kind of looking at this with raised eyebrows.
Yeah. I don't know what to think about this, because on the one hand, you've got people who I have friends who've spoken very highly of Caldwell and Darren Selnick and the other people who were fired apparently for leaking. On the other hand, Hegseth seems to think they leaked. He did a whole, interview where he seems pretty clearly to think that they're responsible for leaking information about something. We don't know exactly what. It's not clear that he thinks they were responsible for leaking the signal chat. It might have been something about, whatever preparations were being made for an Iran strike or something. And, that would make more sense in the context of those guys, because Caldwell is, from Defense Priorities, kind of a, more in the sort of I guess I don't know what the proper way to describe his foreign policy is, but certainly he's not a neocon. Certainly he's not fond of the idea of striking Iran. So did they leak? I don't know. I don't think any of us really know. We're all sort of on the outside looking in, wondering what's actually going on at the Pentagon. Are these guys the victim of sort of soft coup by careers at the Pentagon who are trying to, leak something and then make them look bad? Or did they in fact leak to their friends? Like, I don't know. Hard to say. I mean, we weren't there. So I think we just got to kind of play wait and see here. I think the big overarching premise is I don't want us to fire anybody based on what appears in the pages of like the Atlantic. I think that's been a long time message. It's really important. So, whatever complaining about these Signal group chats, I think that I don't think President Trump's letting go of Hegseth over that. That's all fine. I just, I also want to give Hegseth the benefit of the doubt here. Like, he thinks these guys leaked. He doesn't want them around. He's the secretary. He's the guy who got confirmed. Let him staff his department the way he wants, and achieve the foreign policy goals that we're looking for. And I think there's some overreaction going on where people are like, oh, now we're really going to strike Iran. I don't think that's true. I mean, it's pretty clear that Trump is trying to pull Bibi back from that and trying to do diplomacy first. But two, I think people are really overstating the consequences of an Iran strike. They're saying things like we're going to have a massive global war. I think they really need to look at the last 6 to 12 months of what's actually happened between Israel and Iran and understand that Israel literally already took out all of Iran's air defenses. And this is just a question of exactly like what bombing we're going to do to a country that really can't defend itself. I think everybody would do well to just kind of like reduce the volume. Let's relax for a second and not go crazy.
Yeah, I mean, on the sort of palace intrigue, I don't have any insider information. I will say some of the things that were leaked apparently were troop movements vis-a-vis Panama. So this is not just about Iran, and that's something that is classified that was leaked, but there are non-classified things that found their way to media outlets. So this is obviously one of the tactics of that really gummed up the works in Trump 1. We talked about the deep state, the administrative state, and the inability to fire. Well, part of the other issue was all of this palace intrigue and leaking. And it seems like that was going on. Now, whether or not they had the right people, who knows? Hegseth himself seemed pretty certain in his recent interview. He said that you fire people as investigations turn up certain things. I don't find these folks, by the way, they've answered by saying, oh, well, we didn't take any polygraph tests and our phones weren't searched. That's not, that's not actually, to my mind, very relevant. There's a million other ways they could have found out that these guys are leaking. Maybe they had particular information that was, planted there. You can have a Game of Thrones kind of situation, right? Or a lot of, Megyn Kelly brought up the fact that a lot of agencies, both private and in the government, if they have classified information or sensitive information, they have a log of who's printed what. That could be the basis for firing. But Hegseth was pretty clear that he said there's going to be referrals to the DOJ right over this if that's necessary. So we expect that investigation to continue on the reorganization, right? At the State Department as opposed to the Pentagon. I think this is like something that I feel much more comfortable commenting on than palace intrigue because I just don't know what's going on there. I'll leave it at that. But I think one of the most important things that Secretary Rubio is doing is bringing the so-called human rights agencies and branches, right? And these do exist for a reason. Projecting U.S. soft power in the world is something that I think the capability that we want to continue, but we want to make sure that it's underneath the overarching strategy and goals of U.S. foreign policy. And what was happening is all of these agencies basically independently, these were leftist slush funds. These were agencies that were pushing, sort of a cultural leftist agenda across the world under the auspices of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. soft power, bringing those agencies, either eliminating them entirely, as Rubio is doing to about 17% of the State Department, or to the extent they exist, because like I said, U.S. soft power, I think, is a capability that we want. We want it directed in a way under U.S. foreign policy, auspices and towards goals for, that makes sense for U.S. foreign policy and for our national interests, not sort of off on their own, basically acting in concert with their leftist NGO buddies, which is what was happening, right? So it's bringing all of those agencies to the extent that they're even going to still exist underneath the embassies and then the regional structure of each region of the world, right? Which makes tons of sense. That's like a basic common sense idea of, yeah, like you should basically be reporting if you're doing this kind of soft power work, you should be doing it under the people who are setting U.S. foreign policy for that region, so that you can make sure to support the goals of the foreign policy in that region and not just be off basically doing lefty slush fund, patronage activities. Just as one more note, apparently the agency that has caused a lot of consternation among the conservative parties of Poland and Hungary, because they were pushing LGBT, sort of issues in those more conservative countries. They're supposed to be about backing up or expanding or encouraging democracy in those countries. The democracy spoke against those issues, and they were still sort of active there. Those are part of the agencies that have been eliminated, which I think is worth noting, and probably a good development. So yeah, I think the reorganization that Rubio is undertaking at state is going to be very important for the next 3.5 years.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think my only thing with DoD is just it seems like all the bad people are trying to get Hegseth, and so I'm just for Hegseth. Like I'm just very much I'm Schmittian, okay? Like it's like that's the enemy. Like I can pretty much clearly find the friend-enemy distinction here without kind of doing any deep parsing of stuff I don't have access to. Um, and as far as who's leaking, I think again this is like a substance process issue. Obviously, I don't know. I am concerned, even though I do take Will's point correctly, that people should not um, be excessively apocalyptic and World War III-izing anything that we might do with Iran. It does make me nervous that I think a bunch of people, just like we're seeing with the Supreme Court right now, who really have substantive things that they would like to do, particularly vis-a-vis Iran, that may or may not be aligned with the president's agenda, maybe using a lot of deep state process stuff to take out people who they think might be impeding that. And so I have that kind of broader concern. And then on the state stuff, just really quickly, I think that the reforms were actually very moderate by the standards of particularly what had been leaked before. And so I think they're being very methodical about how they're going about this, and I think that's a good thing.
All right, right back to you, Jeremy, for Pope Francis.
Yeah, so I feel bad that the resident Catholic in this chat, Amber, is not taking this one on. And I think theologically, as a Presbyterian, I think I anathematize the Catholics in the Westminster Confession of 1619. So I'm not going to really deal with this from a religious standpoint. I'm going to really look at the politics of this particular transition that we've now had, and I'm going to ignore the sort of J.D. Vance jokes and whether we should send him to go meet George Soros because he was obviously with the Pope right before the Pope died. I don't have any grand sense of who's going to be picked. I'm just reading the same things that a lot of other people were. I mean, if I did have a pick of the folks I know, it would be Cardinal Sarah from Guinea, but I think that he is both probably too old and too conservative to be picked, even though I think everything I've read from him on has been really terrific. But I do think the kind of broader thing to watch out for is how much will kind of this be a never Trump pick, for lack of a better term. I mean, I hate to put everything in terms of U.S. politics, but with the U.S. really pushing its weight around on the global stage. And I think this is appropriate, by the way. I'm not criticizing that, but just as a reality, we are asserting our prerogatives and maybe not worrying as much about people's feelings getting hurt. Does that react in terms of, I mean, I think obviously no U.S. Cardinal is going to get just sort of taken as a default, but is there some sort of blowback where we wind up with a pope that would take some of the what I would have called, at least politically, the anti-American tendencies of Pope Francis and accelerate those even further? Or will we get maybe a more moderate pick? And I think this is also just sort of a question of your theories of institutional capture by the left. And again, I don't want to sort of oversimplify Pope Francis theologically or politically. I think he was never quite as left wing as sometimes some of his critics made him out to be. But but the church as a whole seems to be getting a lot more conservative, particularly the young priests worldwide. You're seeing more conservative. Um, Francis has allegedly perhaps appointed a lot more liberal cardinals, and so it's sort of the broad question of we had two pretty conservative popes right before Francis. When the left, and again, I hate to oversimplify, but I can't, just doing it for political sake here, takes over an institution, does that mean it kind of gets captured by the left forever? Or is there enough independence in the Cardinals that they're maybe going to say, hey, maybe some of the things that Francis did were warranted, but we want to sort of reset and we're going to wind up with somebody a little bit more centrist or even center right along the lines of Benedict or John Paul. So I think that will be really interesting to see how that plays out in the selection. And I think, look, the Pope is in addition to being the spiritual leader of the world's Catholics, he's a really important political figure. And so I think who gets picked here actually will matter quite a bit.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. And I think you summarized sort of the political paradigm of it pretty well, Jeremy. I do think that Francis was a much more complicated figure than a lot of US politicos would have you believe through their commentary. I mean, yes, he was very liberal on things like the environment and on migrants. Not super surprising. He is a global figure, right? Like, it's not really his job to think about what is best for the United States or what is best for Switzerland or Sweden. He's really coming at his perspectives, or was coming at his perspectives from um, uh, issues of like who are the most vulnerable people globally and what is best for them. And so even though we can disagree with that from a political standpoint, it's not as simple as like Pope Francis wants the US to like take in gangbangers. And so that was kind of frustrating as a Catholic watching that discourse happen. And I mean, a lot of people also don't really understand like where Pope Francis came from. He's obviously a Jesuit. He comes from the South American school of social liberation theology, which is very prevalent among the Jesuits, which is very focused on advocacy for the poor and sort of marginalized or disadvantaged groups. And so that really was the crux of his perspective on a lot of these issues. But you also have to consider that on a lot of the social issues plaguing the world, and specifically as it relates to Catholicism, he stood athwart a lot of the liberalization of things like gender ideology or accepting gay marriage or allowing women into the priesthood. He was very, very firm on those issues. So it really wasn't like just this simple Pope Francis is a leftist that a lot of people like to make it out to be. And I certainly have my fair share of criticisms of some of the things that he did. He also never spoke ex cathedra on behalf of the church. He didn't implement really any new theology, so to speak. So it wasn't as consequential as the leftist media would like to make it out to be. Of course, their framing of this whole thing is like Francis fundamentally transformed the Catholic Church and now it's a liberal institution, and that's obviously not right. All of that being said, obviously conservative Catholics in the US who have seen the degradation of the TLM would love to see someone more conservative to be the next pope. But I think most of all, we just pray for the conclave to exercise wisdom and good judgment and act in accordance with God's will. So that's most of what I have to say about Pope Francis passing away. I'm sure there's more. Maybe I'll think of it with what Will and maybe Inez have to say. But yeah, it's hard to talk about it as like a very politically minded US Catholic, because there are specific issues that are like, oh, you get frustrated when he says things about US political policy, but he's also thinking from a more global perspective. One last thing that I would add on this is like, I think if there is anything that the conclave is looking at for who the next pope will be outside of the political dimension, there were a lot of times where Pope Francis was not entirely clear in things that he was discussing as it relates to political and social issues, and it ended up getting sort of manipulated by the media. So I think they are sensitive to that, and they want someone who is going to speak with both authority but also clarity. There was a lot of confusion, for example, about his comments on like blessing gay couples or blessing people who are involved in gay partnerships. And that was really twisted out of context and taken to mean that like priests can bless people who are involved in sinful behavior when that was not the case. So I think on that point specifically, outside of like whether or not he was left or right, there was often confusion with some of his public statements. And I hope that the next pope can speak with a little bit more clarity so people really understand the statements that he's making as they relate to Catholic dogma.
Yeah. I just don't want him to meddle in our immigration debates. I want the next pope to stay out of it. That's what I like. I mean, rest in peace, Pope Francis. I don't have any agita towards the guy. Like, well, not Catholic. It's, something for the Catholics. But I think that the Vatican, especially given how restrictive the Vatican's immigration policy is and how careful they are about that, I don't want to hear any more from them, any more from the Pope about how rude and how offensive we're being towards migrants. I don't want to hear it. Not interested in the Catholic Church's opinion on that subject. And I think it would be wise for the Catholic Church to be much more vague in the future when they discuss that subject if they feel like making their feelings known.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. I'm not a Catholic and don't follow the sort of politics of the Catholic Church. So as just, perhaps not the kind of global legacy like John Paul II, but nevertheless, I'm sure he did a lot of things for Catholics that I don't know. Like, this is not the sort of thing that I comment on. So we just move on. I'm not comfortable commenting on the Pope.
I appreciate that, Inez, because there have been a lot of people on X who are not Catholics sort of chiming in with their hot takes, and it can be kind of frustrating sometimes from people who like really don't understand like how this all works, and so it's nice to see some like, yeah, I don't really know.
Not my
I don't know.
monkeys.
There will be a new pope. That's the extent of my like prediction here. I think the seat will not be vacant forever. Anyway, so moving on to final thoughts. My final thoughts are on Yale. They're trying to do the encampment thing again, where they're intimidating Jewish students. Yale now has like a notice that they're handing out that's like with a QR code on it that's like, you are in violation of school rules. You need to knock it off. So that's an improvement on Yale's part, a little bit more of efficient and orderly administration, but I don't know that it's going to be good enough. I saw this morning that Harmeet Dillon was already tweeting about it, and it's really fun to say that Harmeet Dillon is the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights now, because Harmeet is she's our girl. So, she sees something on, we can point her, hey, Harmeet, do you see this? This looks like a civil rights violation. She'll be like, sure does. She won't say that actually, because obviously that DOJ can't be biased that way. But internally in her mind, she's saying sure does, and is sending her people off to look at it. So I'm very stoked on having her meet as AAG for this, among many reasons.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring up the same thing, just the continuation of the battles between the universities and the Trump administration. The latest salvo is that Yale has learned apparently just about nothing from the fact that they are extremely vulnerable to having their funding stripped, Title VI grounds, which would be this stuff, but also on a whole host of other grounds. Actually, a colleague of mine, Najira, wrote a great piece in the Daily Wire building on some of what I've written about how to pull funds from universities on civil rights grounds, suggesting that yet another ground that we should be pulling funds on is Title IX grounds and due process rights for those who are accused of sexual misconduct. A lot of these schools have had absolutely egregious constitutional violations over the course of years, and that's not an opinion statement. That's something that's been confirmed by both liberal and conservative appointed justices over and over and over and over again. It's really clear that the process that these schools are using violates the constitutional rights of the accused. If they're going to get into this game at all of adjudicating he said, she said, sexual assault cases, they can't do it in this way. But just like so many other things that universities have been doing over the years that are very clearly violations of either federal law or the Constitution. Basically, the arrangement was, yes, we're going to do these things. yes, we're going to end up settling or losing in court with FIRE or whoever else, religious liberty organizations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're just going to lose these kinds of cases every 2 to 5 years with the one student who was brave enough to and supplied enough and wealthy enough and sort of determined enough to take these issues all the way to the Supreme Court or all the way into federal courts. The universities would fundamentally rather settle and pay out, let's say, $250,000 to that student than take on their left flank, right? And so administrative consequences has been arguing for 10 years and is finally happening. Administrative funding consequences are the only way to direct university behavior on these matters. Winning in court is not enough, because they would still rather just change the words in the policy and continue to do the same behavior and get sued every 5 years and lose because they are that afraid of their left flank. And frankly, they have their own ideological commitments in that direction anyway. So this is the beginning of a long and protracted battle. Title VI grounds are not the only grounds. There are a bunch of others, and as it was shown in the president's list to Harvard. Anyway, this is the beginning of a long battle, and it's been really fun to watch, and it really is like, sort of morning in America when it comes to directing university behavior on the basis of the fact that their entire business model is funded, backstopped, and just fundamentally propped up in every way possible by taxpayer money.
My final thoughts are sort of going back to what we talked about last week with the debate between Dave Smith and Douglas Murray, but a little bit broader on the points about expertise, which Douglas Murray was kind of arguing that actually there are experts that matter. And the free press has chimed into this debate in entirely the wrong way. In my opinion, they published a piece by Tyler Cohen in which he basically says that the elites were actually right about COVID. And I'll just read a little bit of the paragraph that's going viral. It says a lot of people do not want to admit it, but when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic, the elites by and large actually got a lot right. People who got vaccinated fared much better than people who did not. He goes on to praise Operation Warp Speed. That's fine. Long COVID did turn out to be a real thing. Low personal mobility levels meant that often lockdowns were not the real issue. Most of that economic activity was going away in any case. Most states should have ended the lockdown sooner, but they mattered less than many critics have suggested. And in contrast to what many were predicting, those restrictions on our liberty proved entirely temporary. I could probably go point by point and argue against every single sentence in this short paragraph. But I think the broader point is that if you have gotten to a place where you're defending the experts by arguing that actually the policy decisions made during COVID were mostly correct, I think you have totally lost the plot.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. It was really kind of a breathtaking. I mean, it's breathtaking that somebody would write that, quite frankly. I mean, a person of some intelligence and repute. So that was fascinating. I think my final thoughts are just going to be maybe wrapping up a little bit with a combination of what Inez was talking about and then the judges earlier, which is my big concern right now is that the left is overestimating its power and underestimating what the right might be willing to do to challenge it. And you're seeing this in the universities where they're like, well, they wouldn't really take away the $2 billion from us. And I think we need to send the message. And I think we're willing to send the message. Actually, no, yes, we will. We're seeing with the courts that, they won't really ignore a judicial decision. Well, if that means that the Biden administration can bring in 20 million illegals, but we can't get rid of 20 million illegals or 10 million or whatever your favorite number is, honestly, yes, we will. Or at least people like me are going to be pushing for that as hard as we can. And again, that's a dangerous position, not because of the underlying positions that anybody's taking per se, but because if the different groups are not seeing the same reality out there, then it could lead to really unintended escalation far beyond where this needs to go. And it kind of reminds me in some ways of how the establishment kind of desperately did all these underhanded things to kind of keep the Trumpists out. And the end result is rather than kind of cooperating and figuring out a way to go forward together, the establishment was just totally routed. And maybe that's a great thing from my perspective, but it probably wasn't a great thing from a movement building perspective that people didn't figure out how to work together a little better. So I worry that just as a country where the two parties have to work together at some level of reality, that the left is so high on their own supply if you'll forgive me for being a little bit colloquial, that they don't realize the dangerousness with which, the kind of path that they're walking down, and that the right is, I don't think, willing to roll over as much as they have in the past. So, let's hope for a little more wisdom.
And with that, on behalf of Jeremy, Amber, and Will, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.